Hey guys, Coven here back with another RTA Draft Guide video. Today's video is going to be focused on Harsetti because I didn't have a lot of time to record a lot of videos this season, but I wanted to try and get this video out to try and teach people how to play with Harsetti open because last week games usually get a lot more slow, so you're going to be encountering Harsetti if you choose to leave her open. So I think it's good to know how to play with and against her and how like she kind of changes the draft when she's available. So the first thing I'm going to cover in this video is going to be builds for Harsetti matches and then also builds for the units like Harsetti herself and the units you pick in those games. So the first thing we're going to do is look at her passive, which is basically every unit at the start of the battle gets their speed fixed. And Harsetti will always be the fastest unit in that game. She keeps 100% of her speed, and then everyone else gets 90% of their speed. So for example, my Harsetti is 162 speed. So every unit in the game is capped at 146 speed. So that's the maximum speed they can be in that game. And then obviously after that, speed RNG will take effect. So every unit will be around 90% CR. Some of them will be like 87, 88, 89, and then some of them might speed RNG up a little bit to like 91, 92. So it's really like I think that's the biggest complaint about a lot of people where Harsetti makes the game too RNG, and if you're a speed-based player, she ruins so many of your units like Ran, Pera, Seafans and Politis, all those kind of units become completely useless in a Harsetti game. So a lot of aggressive players, people who like to play fast, people who just don't like the RNG speed tuning will pre-ban her, but you will also see a fair amount of games where she's open. So looking at her build first, there are a lot of variations. So there's high effectiveness with the crown artifacts. There's some people just go destro damage, but I think the best of the best is for sure injury plus fairy tale for a nightmare because in Harsetti matches, Harsetti is the best DPS in the game because she's the fastest and she takes the most turns. So injury takes the most advantage of that because every unit in Harsetti games is going to be a slow HP scaler, Last Rider Crow, Blood Moon Haste, Sprite Senya, Ambitious Time, and all these units that scale off of HP. Harsetti just eats them alive with the injury. And then she also, when you combine that with Fairy Tale for a Nightmare, you're injuring units down and you're still doing, when it's max, it's 1.5k per pop. And whoever has Harsetti hits with her skill 1, you get basically 2 procs. So that's 3k fixed damage every turn she's doing. And then she's also injuring them on top of that. So Harsetti is definitely the best DPS in any Harsetti match. So I think injury and Fairy Tale for a Nightmare lets you take advantage of that the most. And you can see I have sorted by speed here to kind of show uh, what Harsetti units look like. So I have my main roster of units, like units you've been seeing for the past how many seasons, like the Rans, the Peiras, the New Moon Lunas, the recent edition of Hellion Lure, the Sea Phantom Politis, all these units, you don't need to gear them differently. It's a very common misconception where people think you have to gear your whole account to play for Harsetti. You don't have to do that at all. Of course, having two of certain units is nice, but it's by no means necessary to play Harsetti because you can work just fine with kind of I use a lot of stuff I don't normally use. I think my fastest Harsetti game unit is Hand Guy because I do pick him outside of Harsetti games as well, so I don't want him like mega slow. So you can see here just 230 speed, a lot of bulk, and then immunity is one of the most important sets in Harsetti games because one of Harsetti's most interesting plays is the fact that she can just skill one, turn one, defense break someone, and with good tuning, if her DPS is going next, it can instantly be a 3v4. So having immunity on these kind of supports like the mediator Coeric is really important. And then if we keep scrolling down, I can show you some more units I pick a lot in Harsetti games. So first example is Destina. I run a lot of ER because if for some reason I'm not able to pick like a hand guy, I want to have like a secondary backup cleanser I can pick. So my Destina is slow. She should be slower to like take more advantage of Arceti, but similar case to hand guy, it's not always against Arceti where I pick Destina. And you can see a good amount of bulk, very high ER. With this, when you combine the buff she gets from her passive, which gives her 60, and then 15 from Ice Crystal, I'm 350 ER in game pretty much. So that's kind of my thinking when I was building this scene. And then Last Rider Crowd gets picked a lot. The current meta is you go protection set, 150, 160, 170 speed maybe, and then you go Aureus. I just run HP set. You can see again immunity because immunity is one of the most important sets in Harsetti games. And as much ER as you can get, ideally 100, but I only have 90, and then just stack HP and defense on your last rider crowd. So it's basically a lot of builds you'll notice are the same builds they used to run, but just more gear score into health and defense and less into speed. Like old school LRK builds would be like 220 plus speed, probably like 3K less HP, around the same defense. You can see Ruel a lot tankier than she was in previous seasons. She's obviously just recently got a buff which brought her back, but still people were running fast Ruels. Harsetti Ruels are just slow, tanky, some FRES here and there. And then ER DPS like Janua, Bloodblade Karen become really good. You can see my Janua is scuffed crit rate because I did steal a piece from him, so I can only fix him with SSS, but you get the idea, just some ER to resist certain debuffs here and there and then stack the rest into damage. I don't really pick Aiden. Phyllis is good in some games when they go like an evasion DPS. You can see here I have my rocket punch on Phyllis, immunity again, very high defense, very high HP, enough FRES. When you add in the, I think it's 60 from her passive, she gets to 150. Bride Senya, uh, I've always run a slower Bride Senya. I slowed her down a bit more for Harsetti, so I can still pick this Bride Senya because Bride Senya really shines in like as an anti-aggro kind of unit. So she's still gonna do that job perfectly fine at 170 speed, and you see 40k HP. I think this is one of my best units because I do have some very good gear on her. You have the 48% HP there. This is like really low gear score, but so much into defense. Flat HP is really good on her. High HP there, high HP there. And then I do like Bastion, which you could say it's anti synergy with her passive, but I enjoy it. Designer Lilibet, a lot similar story here. More defense, more HP, good damage, and then just slower. So you can see, I'm just gonna scroll through some units like there. Mort, Arrowell, Wukong has become really good with his recent EE because his actually does infinite damage. The Haseri you saw previously. I don't really pick Abyssal Euphine. Then I have like an AOL for my Haseri games. I do have multiple AOLs. Ilanov is good. Alencia is good. Empyrean Ilanov is also good. Remnant Violet I mentioned earlier. I'm gonna mention later, sorry, about the preference between Destro and Lifesteal, the Proset Ambitious Tyrant. So I can show you all these units. Like every unit I've showed is not their build right now is not gonna be that different from how they were previously before Harsetti because you don't need to gear your whole account for Harsetti. Just pick a collective of units that you don't use when you're playing fast and you can gear them to play with Harsetti. So I have my main roster of units when I want to play aggro. Like I'll scroll to the top here, you can see the Rans, the Payras, and then I have my kind of slower Harsetti based units. So now that we've looked at some of the builds for Harsetti and units that you usually see, we're going to run through the first draft here, which is going to be from the first pick perspective. You can see my bans for the season is Def Dealer Ray plus Flan, and I think you're gonna run into a lot of games where you see duplicated Flan bans. I think she's the most banned unit this season, and then we have Luna making another appearance this season. She was a staple last season in the pre-bans, and it's a similar story this time. And in this case, we're going to be first picking Empyrean Ilanov, who she I think is for me the best unit in the game right now because the way she warps the draft in the fact that now if I first pick Ilanov, my opponent he can't pick any unit that has like defense penetration without pretty much telegraphing what he's gonna ban, and it just reduces the effectiveness of some of the best units in the Harsetti games, like something like a Bride Senya who is really good in a Harsetti match is doing a lot. She's a lot less impactful now that I first picked Imperial Ilanov. So you always want to take that when you have the opportunity, and likely response you'll see is almost always going to be ambitious Tywin, and then you either see BBK on two or Blood Moon Haste on two. I think you always want to pick Blood Moon Haste in this spot because if you take BBK and you give your opponent Blood Moon Haste on two into Harsetti on 3, I think the game is very unwinnable at that point because these three units, Empyrean Ilanov, Blood Moon Haste, and Harsetti Winder together is like the New Age Exodia because we used to have a thing of like quite a few seasons ago where it was like Conqueror Lilius, Apocalypse Ravian, Mediator Cowrick were like the Exodia where if you get those three, you've won the game. And it's similar story now with the Ilanov, Haste, and Harsetti. So strong drafter will always look to take those away. And then what I like to do here is design a little bit is really good because she does really well into A Tywin and kind of blocks off any like debuff route my opponent could look to take since he's already taken a Tywin. And then I have to go Harsetti here. And I'll explain a bit more in the second draft when I'm looking at it from a second pick point of view. But if you're first pick in this scenario, you have to take Harsetti. And so usual response you see is almost always going to be BBK because she's one of the few like non HP bruiser injury based DPS that you see in Harsetti games, and she's really strong in especially if you have like an ER BBK. I think she's really good here. So you almost always see your opponent take something like a BBK here, and then they'll look to pair that with. I've seen people do Last Rider Crow. I've seen people do Bryce. I think Bryce is really good with BBK because they kind of have that synergy where you're picking your poison, whether you try and trigger the BBK early, take away one of her lives, or you trigger the Senya, leave the Senya. So it's like a kind of making your opponent, forcing your opponent to make a decision, and both sides are pretty devastating. Whether you leave the BBK alive for multiple turns, or you proc the Senya and you get the Bryce resolve into the AOES 3. So most people look to do that, and then I think AOL becomes a really good unit here. I showed earlier the kind of AOL where you have like a really tanky, slower, decent effectiveness to make sure you land your stuff on these kind of units. And I think AOL will be a force burn here. So then you want to pick another unit that has like that does well into these kind of units. I think Alencia could be good here because, or I would probably, I would probably look to take some kind of cleanser here. So like something like Destina, Acades. I think Destina would work well here because uh I run a high effect res Destina, so I don't have to worry about like my opponent just death breaking me with ambitious talent. And I want to make sure I have enough cleanse. So like if for example I had picked so my first thought was to pick something like a DPS like Alencia, but in that case he could ban my designer Lilibet, pick another like death break type debuffer on 5, and if he like manages to CC my Ilanov, the game's pretty much lost for me. So I just pick another cleanser here. I have more than enough damage, like even if he bans Dilibet, these two will do the damage because I basically have 3 DPS on my 1, 2, 3. And then I'm always gonna look to ban last pick, like because that's kind of the advantage of first pick. You can look to you basically get 2 counter picks into your opponent's draft and you get to ban their last pick. So this is kind of looking at playing with Harsetti from a first pick point of view where you get first pick on the unit you want, and then you get to pick your 3 pick protection first. And Harsetti on 3 is the go-to in any draft she's involved in. So most of the time, it's going to be the first pick player picking Harsetti. So this is kind of how you can look to make use of Harsetti when you get first pick and combine her with other strong units like Imperial and Ilanov to pretty much just win straight from the draft. So the second game I'm going to cover here is going to be looking at playing the Harsetti matchups from a second pick perspective. And I'm briefly going to cover why I said in the first game that the first pick player has to take Harsetti here. Because let's say, for example, they don't take Harsetti. Let's say they go for the designer Lilibet and something like a Last Rider Crow on 3. The reason you can't play like you can't draft like this is because you freed up your opponent to just go ignore Harsetti, go open on 3, DPS on 4, and then they can just ban your Harsetti on 4, 5. So in this case, with this pre-ban, I would just go Sea Phantom Policies on 3 alongside Bloodblade Karen on 4 or RB on 4, whichever I want. And you could point out, oh, what if they're banning Luna and Sea Phantom? Similar story, I could just go Hellion Lure on 3, or I could even do Narquoul on 3. I can pick any opener I want on 3 and a DPS on 4, and it's losing for right side always because they have no tempo in their draft at all. So this is why I was pointing out that you have to go for Harsetti on 3. So let's say my opponent still goes for the mitigation on 2 with the Last Rider Crown, and then they go for Harsetti to take advantage of the Ilinov. They pick a Deathbend unit and they pick Harsetti. So in this case, I would always do Angel of Light Angelica plus Remnant Violet. I showed my AOL build earlier, which is like really tanky, high effectiveness to deal with like any ER DPS they might pick. And then my Rylet is like infinite damage because Rylet's specialty is making the game a 3v4 instantly. So I've combined that with the book from my AOL. I can kill any unit in the game with Soulburn. So I could just like go into this Harsetti, kill her off instantly when Rylet takes a turn. And then you could also point out that the lack of lifesteal might be an issue in this like prolonged Harsetti match. But that's where Blood Moon Haste really shows his value because I think Haste often gets compared with Senya, but Haste, I think, is a lot more useful throughout the game, whereas Senya is very reliant on her kind of proc to do stuff. Because Haste has the thing where if he strips a buff and you're on Celestine, it's like people like to call it the most like mitigation in the game because Haste can just fully heal your team every turn if he keeps countering, keeps procking. So I think Haste is really, really strong right now and is really good at protecting something like an MLV who's like a lot more risky, a lot more all in, but he has a sustain of something like a Haste. So Haste is basically acting as my Rylet's lifesteal set in this game. And so my opponent could look to pick something like they need a DPS, so they could just go something like a Bloodblade Karen on 4 plus something like an Amiki on 5. And in this kind of scenario, I could ban either of these. I think I could leave open Amiki because I have a silence unit, a stun unit, haste for sustain. So I would probably I could ban the cleanse. I could pretty much ban anything. I can ban mitigation. So I think it's really difficult for my opponent to come up with a 4-5 that beats my draft, and then force ban last here for me would be like any injury unit pretty much. I think Alencia works really well because he's picked triple HP scalers and Amiki. So for example, I could look to just ban BBK, pick Alencia on 5, and the draft is completely won from there. So uh, briefly, let's cover another scenario really quick where let's say instead of going LRK here, which I think is not as common. I think the more common one you see is they go design a little bit. And so what you should be looking to do here is I would probably take a cleanser on 3 and then a DPS on 4. So cleanse options, hand guy is really good. You saw I run the immunity hand guy, so it forces the Harsetti S3, and then he to basically stop my hand guy, he needs his Dilibet to go right after. And even let's say he gets best case scenario, Dilibet goes after, resets my team. I have Blood Moon Haste for sustain, and I can simply just wait a turn and then go next turn. And then I can pick a DPS here that punishes Designer Lilybet for S3ing early. Something like a Bloodblade Karen is really good. And so, like, that same scenario, Dilibet goes next. If she wants to reset me, she has to give my BBK max use of her passive, which is 50% boost in stats. Then uh, Harsetti based BBKs will run the Alexa's basket. So if I am 0 HP and then I proc the gap, I'm just going to rip my S3 and something will almost always die because it's tanking like a greater attack buff BBK with max passive is so difficult. So my opponent could look to pick something like Amiki plus uh Genua. I've seen Wukong has been actually making a rise, but let's say they go Amiki and something more standard, like uh they just go to tank up with something like a Bright Senya or a what's it called? Or a Genua. So let's say they go Bright Senya. They don't have a good last pick here. Amiki is probably their best option on 4, but it's really difficult to come up with like a good 5 pick they could come here that wouldn't be subject to RNG. Like, for example, Narqual is really good into my team, but if you pick Narqual here, you're completely relying on good tuning from Harsetti, which is never going to be like a reliable kind of way to play the game. So I kind of showed here, this is the advantage of second pick, where second pick in Harsetti games is so adaptable because one game I opted for the cleanser on 3 Media Poetic, and then the other game I opted for a more like debuff-ish based approach with the AOL and the Rylet. So second pick is so adaptable in Harsetti games, and I think is really, really favored. So I hope this video has shown how you can look to take advantage of Harsetti from both first and second pick. Unlikely I will have a video up again this season. I kind of wanted to get this out before people start like their last week climbs for this upcoming end of season on Friday. I will hopefully be able to get more free time next season, and we've got some very interesting units coming out. Like we saw the Kit Senya coming out, who's like she brings a lot more order to her set of games. And then one I'm really excited for is the bystander Huayong, because I think we've been running the numbers and she can one shot something like an Illinois. So she's gonna bring like a new dynamic to the draft where you can't just pick these light nights like people are doing right now. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. Remember to like and subscribe, and I wish you guys all the best in your climb for this season.